Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here, and a quick take to kick off your week. The latest on Russia, Ukraine, and the movement over the past week is from the Europeans. They have been arguing and negotiating for months now amongst themselves on how they would go about seizing or functionally seizing these hundreds of billions of Russian assets that they have, much of which is located in accounts under Belgian sovereignty, and the Belgians didn't want to take responsibility. And they have, as expected, created a workaround. And that is that the EU is now approving an indefinite freeze of all $247 billion in Russian assets. And that is in turn getting Belgian backing to use those assets to support a nearly $200 billion loan to Ukraine. In other words, the Europeans are now ensuring that the Ukrainians have the support financially to continue to fight for another couple of years or more at a minimum, which means that's what the Russians have to expect, irrespective of what the Americans have to say about it. Now, the Ukrainians, by the way, it's a loan, and the Ukrainians are indeed on the hook to pay the money back, but only, and here's the key point, if Russia pays war damages, reparations to Ukraine, as they should, because, of course, the war, the invasion, the Russian invasion is illegal. They're the ones responsible for the damage. They're never going to pay it back. And so the Ukrainians would never have to repay the costs of the Russian assets that were functionally seized. And so that's the outcome. The one weird bit of all of this is that towards the end of the negotiation, the Trump administration said they didn't want the Europeans to move forward in what would functionally amount to a seizure. And you'd think they would, because that ultimately makes it more capable of the Europeans and the Ukrainians to pay for the fighting without the American taxpayers having to be involved. And the key point now is that the Europeans and the Ukrainians get to make more decisions over the future of Ukraine than the Americans do. Now, the Americans are pushing for peace no matter what, but the Americans also, even more fundamentally than that, don't want to have to be responsible for the outcomes. And if what you really care about is not being responsible for the outcome, then that means that the Ukrainians and Europeans are going to be the ones that make those decisions. If you want peace even more than you want responsibility for the outcome, then you have to play more of a role to ensure the leverage over that decision making. And that is a bridge too far for the United States and the Trump administration. And by the way, this makes a lot of sense. It should not surprise anyone out there that the Europeans are the ones that care more about their own security and Europe and Ukrainian security, and they care more about Russia as an adversary than the United States does, especially the frontline states. They're the ones directly threatened. They're the ones that the Russians are engaging in the majority of their asymmetric warfare, the espionage, the strikes on their critical infrastructure, the cyber attacks, all of that much more threatening to the Nordics and the Baltics and the Poles than it is to the Spaniards or the Italians or to the United States. And that is ultimately what got this decision making done. Now, the key point going forward is that Europe on security today is not China on the economy. In other words, the Chinese had the ability and the willingness to hit the Americans back hard and force a deal that is both to the American and to the Chinese liking, or no deal is happening. They both have leverage. They have a level of mutually assured economic destruction, the Americans and the Chinese. The Europeans are not there on security. Now, I mean, the Europeans they recognize the urgency. And they're certainly now spending a lot more on defense than they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and that's going to continue to ramp up. They're doing a lot more to move towards competitiveness and growth and to rationalize an overly bureaucratic environment in the EU. And they should have done that 10, 20 years ago. They're doing a lot more to try to secure their borders against illegal migration. And they should have done a lot more of that 10, 20 years ago. So the question is, given how late the Europeans are, how much of a hole they're in, how much more slowly their countries are growing than the United States, how they don't have the big technology companies, they're not been spending enough in tech, they're not spending enough on defense, is can they get there? Especially can they get there not only with the Americans very impatient, giving them deadlines, fix your security by 2027 or else, but also with the Americans pushing hard in favor of fragmenting the European Union, supporting the most Eurosceptic of movements inside European countries. So, for example, the National Rally, Bardella and Le Pen in France, the Alternatives for Deutschland, the AfD in Germany, and even the UK, whose government wants to work more closely with the EU, but the United States supporting reform and Nigel Farage. If the United States is successful in putting its thumb on the scale, then the EU will no longer be able to continue to move towards more competitiveness and more growth. They won't be able to move towards tightening and securing their borders. They won't be able to move towards stronger European security and defense. Some individual European countries will, but they won't as Europe. And of course, this is the big asymmetry, is that the United States has a federal government, states matter, but ultimately Washington is making big decisions on the global stage, where both for strengthening itself as well as withdrawing itself. For Europe, that has only been partially the case. And if the EU fails, then a fragmented Europe is going to be a lot weaker than the sum of its parts. And ideologically, that is an enormous difference in orientation between the United States and the Europeans, and one that makes the Europeans very, very vulnerable going forward. So that's the question. And you can't really talk about whether eventually a post-G0 world becomes a multipolar, truly multipolar world or not until you understand whether Europe is likely to become a pole as a more state-like institution that has more growth, more competitiveness, more security, more control of its borders, or does it fragment and become weaker? And there are many parts of the world that feel like they're going to fragment and become much weaker in this as the G0 continues to get worse. But what emerges from the G0, we aren't there yet. So that's a little bit of thinking for me. I hope everyone's doing well, and I'll talk to you all real soon.